Good evening. Welcome again to Creekside Book by Book. And today we're going to look at Leviticus 13:47 through 15:33. We are in the purity codes, which are important as we look through these things. Sometimes we read the Old Testament, we read the law, and it can be really easy to say, man, this is boring. Why is this so important? But one of the things to keep in mind throughout Leviticus is the people of God are hosting the presence of God in the tabernacle. And so purity becomes even more important because of the holiness of God in their midst. And I know I've said this before, but I just want to keep that in mind because today what we're going to look at is mold, some more skin conditions, discharges, a lot of stuff. And so I hope you're not squeamish. If you are, I didn't write this, the Bible. I didn't take it up with Jesus. There's some things in here that are not super fun to talk about, but the beautiful thing about these commands for the people is they are given, there's not a lot of guesswork about what they're supposed to do. They're given these commands on how to maintain purity in the camp, how to be cleansed from defilement or impurity, and how to be brought back into the community. And so that's a lot of what we're going to look at today. And then next week, we'll look at the Day of Atonement. And so right in the middle of the book of Leviticus, we have these impurity pieces and the purity codes. And then we have in the middle, the Day of Atonement. And then after the Day of Atonement, we're going to have more commands about laws regarding morality. And so the Day of Atonement is the day where the priest goes into the Holy of Holies and is able to do the sacrifices for the people, and like the once a year holiest day of the whole year. And so keeping that right in the middle of the purity code and the morality laws is helpful to see, like, God is doing something on purpose here, trying to help the people see how to live with his presence, but also like looking at chiastic structure, where we have like a B, C, B apostrophe, A apostrophe. So like an inward, outward type of structure. Like even the book of Leviticus has that as a writing device that helps people remember the order and the sequence of the different events. And so we see chiasms all throughout the Old Testament. And so sometimes if you zoom out enough with a book like Leviticus, there's not a hard chiastic structure, but you can see like, oh, the thing in the middle is the most important thing. And everything else kind of builds out from that. So that's what we're getting to, that most important thing in the middle with the Day of Atonement. So we're a few more passages about impurity, and then we're on to how do we atone for sin that one day of the year. So let's jump in. Chapter 14 or 13, starting in verse 47, talking about defiling molds. Yes. As for any fabric that is spoiled with a defiling mold, and that's like mildew. So keep that in mind. Any woolen or linen clothing, any woven or knitted material of linen or wool, any leather or anything made of leather. If the affected area in the fabric, the leather, the woven and knitted material, or any leather article is greenish or reddish, it is a defiling mold and must be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the affected area and isolate the article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he is to examine it, and if the mold has spread in the fabric, the woven or knitted material, or the leather, whatever its use, it is a persistent defiling mold. The article is unclean. He must burn the fabric, the woven or knitted material of wool or linen, or any leather article that has been spoiled. Because the defiling mold is persistent, the article must be burned. But if, when the priest examines it, the mold has not spread in the fabric, the woven or knitted material, or the leather article, he shall order that the spoiled article be washed. Then he is to isolate it for another 7 days. After the article has been washed, the priest is to examine it again. And if the mold has not changed its appearance, even though it has not spread, it is unclean. Burn it no matter which side of the fabric has been spoiled. If, when the priest examines it, the mold has faded after the article has been washed, he is to tear the spoiled part out of the fabric, the leather, or the woven or knitted material. But if it reappears in the fabric, in the woven or knitted material, or in the leather article, it is a spreading mold. Whatever has the mold must be burned. Any fabric, woven, or knitted material, or any leather article that has been washed and is rid of the mold must be washed again, then it will be clean. These are the regulations concerning defiling mold in woolen or linen clothing, woven or knitted material, or any leather article, for pronouncing them clean or unclean. So, why does this matter? Why would these kinds of molds be important to contain? It's simply because these could make people sick. It is a thing that can contaminate people's bodies, and so they need to make sure that they are doing what they can to maintain health in the community. And if we're thinking about like a tent, like these nomadic people living in tents in the wilderness, it's even more important because this is your house. And so if you have a spreading mold in like a part of the tent of your house, then you need to contain that or eradicate it as soon as possible to maintain health for your whole family. Because then, if you get sick, you could also spread it on to other people in the community. And so there is a health concern with this. Uh, One of the things that we talked about last week, or maybe this was on Sunday after the 9 o'clock service, but just how involved the priests are with these different kinds of examinations. Like they would need to know what to look for. They would need to know like how to manage the spread of these things. And so while the high priest is probably not the one going to house or tent to tent looking for all of these different kinds of molds, the priesthood, this was part of their job, was to maintain purity in the community. And so as they are looking for these greenish or reddish uh, fungus or molds in the fabrics, there is a similar situation to a skin defilement, which is isolation, washing, seeing if it spreads. And if it doesn't spread, then they can cut out the section, or if it fades, they can cut out the section. There's things that they can do to say whether or not they have to just burn the whole fabric. And these fabric materials, whether it's linen or woven material or leather garment, all of these would have been considerably more expensive and harder to produce than with the than like the clay pots and cups that we talked about last week. Those, if there's any kind of defilement in those vessels, they are destroyed because they're porous. We talked about that a little bit last week. But these garments are much more important, much more expensive. So they're working harder to maintain these garments as much as they can. And yeah, so I just want to make sure I am not missing anything of importance so far. So, okay. Yeah. Examine, re-examine, isolate. Jay has a question. Wouldn't this also help with the elimination of spreading diseases? Yes. The isolation, the cleaning, all of those things would also help keep diseases at bay. And so there's definite public health concerns. And, we talked, we've just gone through a whole 15 months of isolation and quarantine, trying to stop the spread, all of this stuff. Like, we don't know how bad a virus is going to be. And we don't know, like, until it starts spreading throughout a community. And so these kinds of molds that could create these illnesses in the people, like, you want to do everything you can to protect the health of others. And so when we look at these kinds of laws, like even in studying this, I was like, man, the Bible is as relevant today as it has ever been. Watch out for other people. If you're sick, stay home. It's a good thing. It's okay. And hopefully we're able to encourage people moving forward to say, like, if you're sick, please stay home. Let's not forget what we learned the last um, the last year and a half, basically. We need to watch out for each other. So that's molds in garments. Let's talk about some cleansing from defiling skin diseases, because now we're getting into, last time we looked at like what are the diseases, and so this time we're going to look at some of the process of restoration back into community after somebody has recognized they have some kind of defiling skin disease. So verse 14:1, the Lord said to Moses, "These are the regulations for any diseased person at the time of their ceremonial cleansing. When they are brought to the priest is to go outside the camp and examine them. If they have been healed of their defiling skin disease, the priest shall order that the 2 live clean birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the person to be cleansed. Then the priest shall order that one of the birds be killed over fresh water in a clay pot. He is then to take the live bird and dip it together with the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop into the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. 7 times he shall sprinkle the one to be cleansed of the defiling disease, and then pronounce them clean. After that, he is to release the live bird in the open fields. That person to be cleansed must wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe with water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. After this, they may come into the camp, but they must stay outside their tent for 7 days. On the 7th day, they must shave off all their hair. They must shave their head, their beard, their eyebrows, and the rest of their hair. They must wash their clothes and bathe themselves with water, and they will be clean. So this process of restoration is a gradual bringing back into the community. It's not just like, hey, you've been out 7 days, you're fine, come on in. They've been put outside of the camp until they could send a message somehow to the priest to say, I think I'm getting better, right? Or they're just hitting that 7-day mark, which was kind of the minimum, and the priest comes out to see them outside the camp. And if they look and say like, oh, they look better, the whatever lesion or sore or white spots or whatever's going on that's causing them to be unclean is diminishing or is gone, then they have this ceremony of bringing them back in after the examination. And it starts with the 2 birds, the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop. And the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn were probably chosen because they are reddish, and so they would symbolize blood. And this is what people were, and commentators were saying, they're reddish. They would make the water a bit reddish, and the blood of the one bird all put into that pot. And the hyssop was then probably dipped into the pot and used to sprinkle the person that 7 times. The bird, the live bird, is wild. And so it's not like a tame bird. They have to go catch a live bird from the wild to bring it into the camp and dip it in the water and set it free outside of the camp. And we'll see this again with the Day of Atonement regulations, because there's a scapegoat. And so maybe a similar kind of principle where this ceremony is not really concerned with actually cleansing anybody. It is a ceremony that is representative of cleansing. And so the bird that is going to be released is like saying this bird is taking the impurity, the defiling disease of this person out into the wilderness. The same way we'll look at next week, the scapegoat takes the sins of the people of Israel out into the wilderness to Azazel, which is the wilderness, the place where the goat is supposed to go to judgment of a sort. And so this is all part of the process, is like they come in, they do this, and then they are they're washed, and they have to shave all of their hair so that they can, like, so people can see, the priest can see, like, yes, there is no more defiling skin disease, like, because like even a beard like can hide a lot of stuff. And so like shave all their hair and say, all right, you're clean. And then they still are not fully brought into the camp. They've got that one more 7-day period where they are outside the camp, or not outside of their tent, but they're back in the camp. And so then after that 7 days, the priest comes again to see, like, are you like fully clean? And if they are, at that point, they wash again, they shave, and they say, yes, see, I am still totally clean. And this is part of the restoration process for these folks. And this involves washing their clothes, washing their body, shaving, all of these different things. And so like looking at why they might come back to the tent and not go into the tent is maybe there's something in the tent that nearby that could be bringing some illness to them, to their skin disease. Maybe they have an allergic reaction to something. Like we should know this. And so they're just easing them in into the tent. So then on the 8th day, verse 10, they must bring 2 male lambs. And so after the second like isolation period, that is not fully isolation, but eased back isolation, after the 8th day, they must bring 2 male lambs and 1 ewe lamb, a year old, each without defect, along with 3/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, and 1 log of oil. The priest who pronounces them clean shall present both the one to be cleansed and their offering before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then the priest is to take 1 of the male lambs and offer it as a guilt offering, along with the log of oil. He shall wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. He is to slaughter the lamb in the sanctuary area where the sin offering and the burnt offering are to be slaughtered. Like the sin offering, the guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. The priest shall then take some of the log of oil, pour it on the palm of his own left hand, dip his right forefinger into the oil in his palm, and with his finger sprinkle some of it before the Lord 7 times. The priest is to put some of the oil remaining in his palm on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. The rest of the oil in his palm the priest shall put on the head of the one to be cleansed and make atonement for them before the Lord. Then the priest is to sacrifice the sin offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from the uncleanness. After that, the priest shall slaughter the burnt offering and offer it on the altar, together with the grain offering, and make atonement for them, and they will be clean. So this part of the restoration process is dealing with sacrifices. And so this guilt offering may have a couple different functions. One function is maybe this skin disease is a judgment from the Lord. That is a possibility. And so that this offering is given in a way of atoning for that sin, to say this person may have done something wrong. It could also be that while they were in isolation, they may have missed some of the rhythms of the regular worship cycles. And so this is a offering to make up for lost time, to say they may have missed some things. And so we just want to make sure that they are brought back into the community, cleansed of any guilt that they may have failed to honor the Lord with their offerings and the regular worship practices, and be brought back in that way. The priest, like, their job is to go and examine these different things. And so this offering is given to the Lord, but the priest also benefits from this offering, as we saw with the different tithes and offerings. Some the priests were able to keep for their family. Some offerings were burnt entirely up to the Lord. And so here the priests do have a portion of this that they get to take as a kind of payment for their services, like a doctor would be paid for their services in examining all of their different defilements. And so the similar kinds of patterns are happening, as you can see with the different offerings, sprinkling on the altar, sprinkling the different places with the blood and the oil. But then also what was interesting as I reading through this and looking at it is like the same kind of anointing that the priests were given when they were consecrated to the Lord. That same kind of right earlobe, right thumb, right toe. Those same kinds of practices are now put in place for the person who is being brought back into community. And so they are being made holy before the Lord as a way, in a similar way. And so, and then whatever is left from the oil that's in their hand is then put on their head. And when we look at anointing oil in the Old Testament, like our traditions in modern churches, like if you were being anointed with oil, it's like a little cross on your forehead or something like that. But here, like there would have been a good amount of oil, and it would have been put like just slathered right on the person's head, and reminds us of Psalm 133, how good and pleasant it is for brothers to live in unity. It is like dew on Mount Hermon. It is like oil flowing down Aaron's beard. It's like that kind of anointing, that kind of presence of God that rests on people. Like, so that's a lot of oil that we should be thinking and picturing when we think about anointing people. And so this is part of the bringing back. So there's the 2 lambs and the ewe lamb. And then what if they can't afford that? And we saw earlier in the sacrificial system that there were provisions for those who could not afford the sacrifices. And the same is true here in verse 21. If, however, they are poor and cannot afford these, they must take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved to make atonement for them, together with 1/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, a log of oil, and 2 doves or 2 pigeons, such as they can afford, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day, they must bring them for their cleansing to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest is to take the lamb for the guilt offering together with the log of oil and wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. He shall slaughter the lamb for the guilt offering and take some of its blood and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. The priest is to pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and with his right forefinger sprinkle some of the oil in his palm 7 times before the Lord. Some of the oil in the palm he is to put on the same places he put the blood of the guilt offering, on the lobe of the right ear, on the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of their right foot. The rest of the oil in his palm, and the rest shall put on the head of the one to be cleansed, to make atonement for them before the Lord. Then he shall sacrifice the doves of the young pigeons, as well as such as the person can afford, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, together with the grain offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement before the Lord on behalf of the one to be cleansed. These are the regulations for anyone who has a defiling skin disease and who cannot afford the regular offerings for their cleansings. And so, so it's just, I find it fascinating that the law makes provisions for people, whatever their economic status. There is no exclusion for people from honoring the Lord. Like they're making it possible for people to do this. And regardless of the offering, the end result is exactly the same. The priest makes atonement before the Lord, and the person is declared cleansed, and they may now fully reintegrate into the community's life and worship. And so if you are living outside of the camp for any period of time, the desire to be back with your people is going to be quite strong. And so if we look at all of these different regulations and these rituals and ceremonies around the cleansing, like there is a lot to do, right? But where there's also a opportunity to make this a time of rejoicing for the people as they are walking through the last of these ceremonies, to say, I am brought back into the community, and I'm going to celebrate the grace of God, the mercy of God, and the restoration of God. And so this is an opportunity to rejoice. And when we look at, when we read the law, like we're not given a lot of like, this would have been a party, but this probably would have been a party for the people who are being brought in, like, welcome home, welcome back. So that's how people with defiling skin diseases are brought back into the community. Let's look back at cleansing from the defiling molds. So we talked about molds, and now how do we get back in. So verse 33, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when you enter the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as a possession, and I put a spreading mold in a house in the land, the owner of the house must go and tell the priest, I have seen something that looks like a defiling mold in my house. The priest is to order the house to be emptied before he goes in to examine the mold, so that nothing in the house will be pronounced unclean. After this, the priest is to go in and inspect the house. He is to examine the mold on the walls, and if it has greenish or reddish depressions that appear to be deeper than the surface of the wall, the priest shall go out to the doorway of the house and close it up for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest shall return to inspect the house. If the mold has spread on the walls, he is to order that the contaminated stones be torn out and thrown into an unclean place outside the town. He must have all the inside walls of the house scraped and the material that is scraped off dumped into an unclean place outside of the town. Then they are to take the other stones and replace these and take new clay and plaster the house. And so if the Lord, there's an interesting line here as they go into Canaan, and God says, if there is a mold that, if I put a spreading mold in a house in the land, and so some read this and say there may be a judgment on that house from the Lord. Another way to read it is just to say, like, God knows how creation works. God knows how mold happens, and he may be like, he's not surprised that this happens. And so there is a process to bring restoration. And so it starts with examining the house. But before the priest comes and examines the house, because anything in the house that's contaminated would be dirty, like, there's a little bit of grace here that says, take everything out. Everything that's in the house, take it out so that it won't be called contaminated and declared unclean. Because if it's declared unclean, then it will need to be destroyed. And so, so he goes in, looks and sees what the walls looking like. And if it's defiling, the walls would have been like bricks that had a stucco or adobe kind of material on top of it, a plaster. And so they scrape off all the plaster. If it's in the brick, you got to take the brick out and replace the brick, which sounds like a lot of work. But you want to eliminate any kind of contamination. And so those unclean elements, the plaster, the bricks, are all taken outside of the town. Like the bird takes the defilement outside of the camp. The same kind of principle is happening here, where the priest is removing the impurity from the house. And so after that is happening and they put this stuff back in, they replaster, and hopefully that did the job. But in verse 43, if the defiling mold reappears in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house scraped and plastered, the priest is to go and examine it. And if the mold has spread in the house, it is a persistent defiling mold. The house is unclean. It must be torn down, its stones, timbers, and all the plaster, and taken out of the town to an unclean place. So a whole building can be deemed condemned because of these kinds of defiling molds. And so this is one of the reasons why getting on these situations early, hopefully eliminating the contamination, would have been good. But if they don't, the whole house is destroyed, removed from town, and rebuilt. And again, it's thinking about what mold does in a person's body. You can get really, really sick. And so while these kinds of germ theories and stuff, they were not a part of the biblical account, there is an awareness that this makes people sick. We should do what we can to not breathe these mold spores in. And so what if the people are in the house? And verse 46 gets to that. Anyone who goes into the house while it is closed up will be unclean till evening. Anyone who sleeps or eats in the house must wash their clothes. But if the priest comes to examine it and the mold has not spread after the house has been plastered, he shall pronounce the house clean, because the defiling mold is gone. To purify the house, he is to take 2 birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. He shall kill one of the birds over the fresh water in the clay pot. Then he is to take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, and the live bird, dip them into the blood of the dead bird and the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He shall purify the house with the bird's blood, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. Then he is to release the live bird in the open fields outside the town. In this way, he will make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. These are the regulations for any defiling skin disease, for a sore, for defiling molds in fabrics or in a house, and for a swelling, a rash, or a shiny spot to determine when something is clean or unclean. These are the regulations for defiling skin diseases and defiling molds. So, got a nice little summation there, closing passage on these kinds of defiling skin diseases and molds. There's a process for healing, for restoration, for cleansing, and even here in the house, it gets back to the same kind of basic principles of purification: the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, the hyssop, the water, the two birds, the dipping of the bird, and the sprinkling of the different elements with the mixture of blood and water, with the hyssop branch, and releasing the bird into the wilderness, taking the sign, the defilement outside the camp. And so the priest's job of examining these different things and understanding like how to tell if it's a spreading or not, like all those things are all there to help the people maintain purity in the community. So as we are thinking, this kind, like one of the commentaries that I read was published in the 90s, and there were different kinds of viruses kind of growing, and that's when I first heard about Ebola, and they actually reference Ebola. The Ebola virus was this thing that, if you saw Outbreak, the movie Outbreak, like that was like everybody was afraid of Ebola, and it's a bad, terrible disease. And so like we hear about those kinds of outbreaks for a long time. Like we'd hear about it happening over in Africa, or SARS spreading wildly in Asia, and like all these things. And you think, man, that's terrible in those other countries. But then it comes home and it's spread. Like we lived through this pandemic. And just reading through these verses, thinking like, man, how good it is that the Lord showed concern for the health of his people, that he would create these kinds of laws to tell them, like, you've got to watch out for each other. You've got to be careful. And so this is not about an intrusion in privacy or God's control over people's lives. Is like he's trying to protect them from disease. While also we recognize that he is not, like, he can't have that kind of impurity in himself, because God is holy and without any kind of defilement. And so there's that tension as well as we read these passages, that God is different and other, and if the people are welcoming him, he is to be surrounded by purity. Also, we should note one more thing. The priest goes into all of these places. The priest never seems to be worried about taking on defilement from those houses or looking at these diseases. Like there is a sense of divine protection for the priest. They could get sick, but they know their job is to care for these people and to help them bring restoration back into their lives. And as we look at clean and unclean people throughout the Bible, and even in like the New Testament, looking at skin diseases, and the lepers, and Jesus healing the leper. I'm just always struck by the leper that came to Jesus and said, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." And the gospel says that Jesus touched the man and said, "I am willing," and he was healed. And so Jesus is not afraid of taking on the defilement of the leper in his time. And I just find that fascinating. He is our prophet, our priest, and our king, and he's serving in this priestly role. And even as he heals the lepers, he says, "Go and present yourself before the priests to fulfill all of the commands of the law." And these are the commands he's talking about. How do you get restored back in to community with the people of God? So So God is, while we are not in a single camp and, walking through these same kinds of things, the theological principle that we should hold on to from this is that God does care about our physical health, and we should do what we can to protect ourselves, to practice good health, but also as a way of protecting others and looking out for them. So, all right, we have one more chapter that we're going to look at tonight, chapter 15, and it has we're going to talk about bodily discharges. And so there is going to be a bit of a chiastic structure. So we're going to look at the introduction, and then abnormal male discharges, and then normal male discharges, normal female discharges, abnormal female discharges, and the conclusion. So there's a bit of a chiasm there as we are walking through this one chapter. These are all parts of human life. And I live with a nurse, and she tells me all kinds of super gross stories all the time. And so I'm kind of numb to this kind of talk. But if you are squeamish, I'm just warning you now. And I won't read that. All right. So let's just jump right into this. 15:1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any man has an unusual bodily discharge, such a discharge is unclean. Whether it continues flowing from his body or is blocked, it will make him unclean. This is how his discharge will bring about uncleanness. Any bed that a man with a discharge lies on will be unclean, and anything he sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Whoever sits on anything that the man with a discharge sat on must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Whoever touches the man who has a discharge must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. If the man with the discharge spits on anyone who is clean, they must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Everything the man sits on when riding will be unclean, and whoever touches any of the things that were under him will be unclean till evening. Whoever picks up those things must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Anyone the man with the discharge touches without rinsing his hands with water must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. A clay pot that the man touches must be broken, and any wooden articles is to be rinsed with water. When a man is cleansed from his discharge, he is to count off 7 days for ceremonial cleansing. He must wash his clothes and bathe himself with fresh water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day, he must take 2 doves and 2 pigeons and come before the Lord to the entrance to the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest is to sacrifice them, the one for the sin offering and the other for the burnt offering. In this way, he will make atonement before the Lord for the man because of his discharge. So this is an unusual discharge situation. It's not just like going to the bathroom, or it's like maybe a blockage, so a urinary tract infection or some kind of thing that could be keeping from discharge, or there could be some kind of disease like gonorrhea that the man could have that is creating these kinds of discharges. And so in ancient cultures, one of the things that we should note is some of these kinds of discharges were believed to be evidence of demonic presence in a person. And so we don't see that spelled out here in the law for the people of Israel, but it's something that the people of Israel were not the only ones who were concerned about these things. There were other cultures that also talked about this kind of stuff, and they tied it to a spiritual force. And so the same kinds of isolation, anything the person touches being unclean, all of this is because they're trying to limit the spread and reduce contamination and impurity in the community. And when he is cleansed from the discharge, we have a similar process of coming back into the community with the 7 days, the washing, the cleansing. Instead of the lambs, the person is bringing in birds. That's the the foundation. It's not as expensive or costly of sacrifices to be restored into the community for these things, but a lot of the similar kinds of practices. So that's for discharges caused by disease of some sort. So for a non-abnormal, so a normal discharge, verse 16, when a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Any clothing or leather that has semen on it must be washed with water, and it will be unclean till evening. When a man has sexual relations with a woman, and there is an emission of semen, both of them must bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. And so this is specifically talking about the natural process of what happens during sexual intercourse. And so it is not a sacrifice of any sort that the people need to make to be brought into the community. They are just, they are to wash and be cleansed, and they are unclean until evening. Now, where does this come up later? This is interesting because hundreds of years from now, King David is on the run, and they go to the tabernacle, and David asks the priests for shelter from Saul. And one of the priests asks David, have any of you been with any women? And David says no. Why is that important? Because this kind of, if they're on the run and they had been with a woman, but they had not had a chance to wash after intercourse, then they would be unclean until they wash after intercourse. And if they're unclean, then they can't go into the tabernacle. And so like these kinds of little connections happen throughout the Bible. And when we like read those stories and don't keep in mind these purity codes, then the Bible is really strange and weird. When we remember the purity codes, the Bible still may be strange and weird, but it's consistent. It follows a consistent line of logic, and the laws and regulations are, we're seeing that the laws and regulations are being followed, even if imperfectly. They are following a lot of these laws. And so the regular intercourse, like that, there's nothing evil or wrong here with intercourse and there's this normal discharge of semen. And so that's why there's no like sin offering or anything like that. So the next one is the regular discharge for menstruation, verse 19. When a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean till evening. Anything she lies on during her period will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Anyone who touches anything she sits on will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Whether it is the bed or anything she was sitting on, when anyone touches it, they will be unclean till evening. If a man has sexual relations with a woman and her monthly flow touches him, he will be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. Again, this is a focus on the regular discharges of the human body. There is no sin here that they are monitoring. What is the greater concern is the loss of blood, because blood is the life force of a person. And so there is a intensity and intentionality around blood for the people of Israel. And so touching blood is a way to be made unclean outside of the regular sacrifices, another person's blood. And so here, if it is a menstruation, this is one more way, like, keep in mind, this is a part of life. This is a part of the regular reproductive cycle. And so honor the reproductive cycle that the Lord has put in place is kind of what is going on here. And so the impurity lasts for the evening unless a man has sexual relations with a woman during her period, and then he is unclean for 7 days as well. And so I have a friend who I went to grad school with, and I went to George Fox. It's an evangelical school. He has a Jewish heritage, and he actually converted to kosher Judaism while in his Doctor of Ministry program, which is funny. in a couple different ways. But, one of like a person in the Jewish culture now who like is going to take these laws seriously, like has a different room of the house for his wife while she's on her period, because they want to make sure that they don't bring this kind of defilement into the house. Now, this seems extreme. I get that. But it is a issue of blood, and it is an issue of honoring life. And so just like with childbirth, there is a loss of blood. And so there's a purification and a ritual for that. It is not a sin issue. It is just a respecting the boundaries, and following these rites become important as a way of honoring the biological systems that God has put in place. So there are also irregular discharges that we should look at here. So when a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she may count off 7 days, and after that she will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, she must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest is to sacrifice one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. In this way, he will make atonement for her before the Lord for the uncleanness of her discharge. You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place, which is among them. These are the regulations for a man with a discharge, for anyone made unclean by an emission of semen, for a woman in her monthly period, for a man or a woman with a discharge, and for a man who has sexual relations with a woman who is ceremonially unclean. So this irregular discharge is not unlike the woman in the Gospels who had an irregular flow of blood for 12 years. She lived as an unclean person in her community for 12 years because of these laws. And so the desperation that she had to reach out and touch Jesus, just touch the hem of his garment, there's a great desperation because she's a walking dead person. And Jesus is trying to, like, when we see Jesus like stop and to say like, I felt power leave me, and he's doing that intentionally. He's bringing attention to the fact that this woman who was unclean has been healed, and has been restored, is in the process then of being restored back into the community. And so there's also this similar kind of regulations about the rituals for cleansing, with the count off 7 days. 8th day, bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons and bring them to the tent, make the offering. And this is all part of making atonement for her. Just like the man with the unusual or irregular discharge, there is the same concern for the woman who may have this irregular discharge. And why is all this in here? Because the Lord is dwelling among the people of Israel. And so he is calling them to holiness, to purity, as a reminder to them that he dwells among them with his holiness. And holiness has a spatial dimension in the Old Testament. And so contact with unclean things with the sanctuary would be the ultimate defilement. And so this is why it's so important for the people to watch out for any kind of defiling influence, because it would also keep them, could potentially keep them from worshiping the Lord. Now, there's a way to make this more painful than it has to be for people. And so treating people terribly because of medical conditions that they have, that is not what this is about. This is about protecting the whole community from any kind of spreading disease, because God cares about the community. And so there would need to be probably some kind of compassion, benevolence, mercy for these folks, because they can't work while they're out there in that camp. They can't be with their family. There's so many things that they are isolated from, but also the isolation is a period of rest that potentially could bring healing and recovery in their body. And so it's hard to do that, but it is also an important part of the healing journey. So as we see these laws put in place, there's a lot of things that we are like, man, that seems like a lot of work. But holiness can be a lot of work. And for us as followers of Jesus today, we want to respect these laws, look for the theological principles that are still applicable to Christians. And the primary one is Jesus takes our impurity. That's important for us today. But also, like, we should an important theological principle in all of this is we should protect the health of the community. Yeah, that's one way that we can glorify God. And so that is a big topic that we've all gone through for the last 15 months. And hopefully we will be stepping out of this season of social distancing, isolation, all of that different stuff with COVID into a future that where we will be mindful of watching out for each other still, but not dealing with an active virus that is bringing a lot of harm to a lot of people. So, all right, with all that, any questions on molds, discharges, skin diseases? So Catherine is asking, is there a special significance regarding 7 days and on the 8th day bring the sacrifice? See this throughout the Bible. Yeah, good point. Good catch. One of the key things is 7 days is a period of completion following the creation rhythms, Catherine. And so one of those things could be, making sure that they are observing a Sabbath rest somewhere in there. The 8th day then would be after that potential Sabbath rest to come into a new week. And so whenever we see that 7-week rhythm, whatever's happening on the 8th day is like a new day of a new creation, a new restoration moment. So yeah, so that was a good question. And then Jay also asked in the chat, wouldn't this also help with the elimination of spreading diseases? Did I already answer that?
You did answer that.
Okay. Yeah. So, but it would, like, this would, isolation is without germ theory, without the CDC or the World Health Organization, without all the years of science that we've had around germ theory, like, it's amazing that these kinds of laws and theories were put in place, and we're still practicing a lot of this isolation stuff today. Like, you're sick, go in quarantine. Like, stop, don't spread it around. Yeah, that's an important thing. So one of the funny things, like with having kids, you go to the end of the year things at elementary school, and one of the awards that they give at the end of the year is who has not had any sick days. And it's amazing that any kid in elementary school didn't have any sick days, because having had 2 students who lived through elementary school, they were sick a lot. And so it's like, how did this happen? Were these kids just going to school sick? And it always made me like, why are you doing that? Like, you're spreading your flu all over the place. Like, please keep your kids
How do you
home.
think your kids got sick? It was those kids that were there every day.
Yeah. So it's hard. When we look, like, I look at that and I feel like you just keep your kids home, right? But at the same time, like, a lot of these families, they don't have jobs and the means to not go to, or jobs that have sick days, or the means to take a day without getting paid. And so there is a benevolence need here as well. If we see, like, kids are sick at school, it's like, what can we do to help families be able to stay home, stay healthy for their kids, so that they're not spreading the disease? Because it's a whole systemic problem. So yeah, anyway, I'll get off that soapbox. So, any other questions on defiling molds, skin conditions, or discharge? Anything? Super fun stuff.
I just really appreciate the fact that you broke the mold on this one.
I get it.
Do you want a broke the mold?
Yeah. Good job, Jay. I'm proud of you. That was fantastic. All right. Yeah. Any other thoughts, puns, or questions?
I've got one on the mold scenario. I thought it was weird that they closed the place up because I know with mold, most of the time you want to air it out and dry it out.
Yeah.
Right?
So let me get to that. Let me go back. So they did kick everybody out of the house, and so it's closed up, but I don't think it necessarily means that they like boarded up the windows. I think it's more that they closed it from like they temporarily condemned the building. Like no one should be in here.
Keep people out.
Yeah.
I mean, I would think, okay, open up the windows, open up the doors, just keep everybody out of there. Let the place dry out.
Yeah. So that's probably what would happen. So the family, like they took all their stuff out. So they're probably like camping in their front yard, you know, or what would be similar to a front yard in our mind. They're camping out there with all their stuff because they didn't have a pods where they could put all their stuff in pods and then they go to a storage facility. Like they had to wash their stuff. So they're right there. And so if they are near the house, then they probably didn't have to like lock the doors and like board everything up and just say like, you can't go in here. Like open windows. And windows were not like our windows. Like it was a hole in the wall with maybe some fabric over it. So they would probably just let the wind, like keep the fabric open and let the air flow. But yeah, they weren't like getting ready for a hurricane or anything like that. So like
they were discharged from their home.
Oh man, you're just on fire today, Jay. That's fantastic. So Catherine asks, were they still living in a desert? Well, the land of Israel has a wide range of climates. And so there are some very dry areas and some very lush areas. And so the household commands specifically in verse 14:33, that transitions into when you get into the land of Canaan, which I'm giving you. So he's talking specifically about houses at that point, not necessarily living in the desert at that point. And a lot of the houses, something to keep in mind, we'll see, the Lord will talk about, you're going to go into towns that have already been built and you're going to drive the people out of those towns and you're going to live in those houses. So there may be some houses that have molds in them that the people didn't know about. And so like, because they are displacing people and taking their homes, which is a problematic thing in our culture too. Like it's one of those things where like, yikes, what's happening? And so we'll get to that when we get to Joshua. We don't have to talk about that stuff just yet. So yeah, so there's houses there that they may not know the whole history of the maintenance and the upkeep. And so they could be surprised by this mold that showed up. Like it wasn't disclosed on the homeowners and home inspection when they moved in. So, which every homeowner has probably had one of those things where it's just like, this wasn't on the inspection. Yikes. So, yeah. Any other thoughts on this passage?
Yeah, I had a quick question. It's not really about all the mold and stuff, but in the ceremony, like the cleansing ceremonies, one of the things that was mentioned was the wave offering. And I remember hearing about that before, but can you remind me like what the significance of that is?
Yeah. Good question. Because the wave offering is kind of strange to us. Like it's essentially like the priest lifts it up before the Lord and says like, this is from you, this is for you. And so it is it's part of the honoring the Lord. And often the wave offering, then the priest, that would be a part of their compensation for their services. And so it's like, this is for the Lord, but the priest is they're not going to burn all of it on the offering. They're not going to like pour all the oil out. They will take some of that to support the priests for their work. So does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of different offerings that are happening in Leviticus. And so sometimes it can be a little, this is a sin offering. This is a burnt offering. It is most holy. This is a guilt offering. This is a atoning offering. Like there's a lot of different processes that are put in place in the temple, the tabernacle worship system. But yeah, the wave offering is just it's a acknowledgement of God's goodness and gratitude for all that he has done. And so as a wave offering in this piece, as they're restored back, is like, Lord, you have brought them back into the community. We thank you for your provision. So they wave, like they lift it up before the Lord. And that's why it's called a wave offering. So yeah, but they're not just like waving to it as it's burning on the altar. Bye. So yeah, but these offerings, there's a lot. You guys, I'm like really excited that we're getting through Leviticus together. Like this is one of those things where people will be like, why are you talking about Leviticus? It's like, because it's important. It's in here. So we should understand it a bit more than just like saying like, I'm going to read it real fast. So, and even this, we're reading it not slow. We're going through a lot week to week. But yeah, it's fun times. So any other questions or thoughts?
I got one in 15:7 when we're talking about the discharges and stuff. It says, whoever touches the man who has a discharge must wash their clothes, bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. I mean, did they just have one group? I mean, would that be their own family members? So the whole family as a whole who'd be taking care of that person would be done? Or did they actually have people like nurses maybe? I mean, it doesn't expound on that, but you just got to wonder. I'm sure it was their family only that was taking care of them, like probably the wife, or or the kids.
Right. Yeah. So that could be part of the care for them. So it's probably family. It could be a doctor type person who is caring for them. It could be like it could be somebody that you bump into on the road though too. Like if whoever touches the man who has a discharge must wash their clothes. So like this doesn't necessarily mean like as you are caring for a person, it could be a lot bigger than that. And so that's one of the reasons why like the people with leprosy were shunned in the culture, was because like, don't touch me, you're unclean. And so if somebody who has an irregular discharge like this is like bumping into people and like making them unclean, like that is that's just a jerk move, right?
Yeah.
And so you want to isolate that person so that they don't have a wide range of whoever's. And so it could be a family person, could be the doctor. I do think it's interesting that the next verse, if the man with discharge spits on anyone, so sometimes there are jerks, right? And here's this guy is like, he spit on somebody. Like, what is this? And so is this like coughing? It could just be this person is sick all over. They cough on somebody. It could be that this person's just a jerk and spits on somebody. And so, there are all kinds of regulations. But ultimately, like, you want to limit the spread, contain the spread, like all of those things that we've heard over and over again this last year. This is what this is about right here. So watch out, care for people. Don't spread your viruses to other people. Do what you can to be healthy and to protect the health of the community. So,
Jason, did Jesus have to wash and bathe after that woman touched him?
Sydney, that is a really great question.
Yeah.
We have no record of that.
Yeah.
So we have no record of Jesus doing any kind of ceremonial washing ever. Ever. the closest thing we have is his baptism. And then when they wash, the woman anointed his feet, and when
Yeah.
he washed the feet of his disciples, like, but Jesus washing, like, we don't get that. And the disciples are even confronted by the religious leaders at one point, saying, like, how come you all don't wash your hands the way we're washing our hands? So it's just an interesting little detail in the life of Jesus, is we don't see a lot of washing. But part of that, I think, is because he is not affected by sin. He is surrounded by sin. He is perfectly human and perfectly God. And so he is tempted in every way as we are, yet is without sin. And so, like, there's no place, and this is just pure speculation, okay? But because there is no sin in his life, there's no place for disease to take root in his body. Like, I don't know. That's how I come to think about that. And so, like, I don't think he's super worried about these diseases. So I'm looking for the passage where Jesus, okay, it's Luke chapter 8. So let me just give you kind of a background of what's happening. So this is Luke chapter 8. So in 8, we see Jesus walking on the water and meeting the disciples on the sea, right? Then he heals a demon-possessed man. So he heals an unclean spirit. He drives the unclean spirit out of the person, which is awesome. Sends it into an unclean animal, or a herd of unclean animals, the pigs. Then they're coming back across the sea because the people in Gennesaret, where the demoniac was, they freaked out. So they come back across the sea, and Jesus is going to Jairus's house to heal his dead daughter. His daughter is dead. A dead body is unclean. And on the way, this unclean woman touches him. She's unclean. He's not worried about it. He goes to the dead daughter, who is technically unclean, touches, like restores her back to life. Sorry, he said she's not dead, she's sleeping. They laughed at him. And then he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Jesus is not afraid of touching unclean things. I'm sorry. I love, like, the way that Luke is telling the story. He's doing this on purpose. Like, he's like, Jesus is not afraid to confront unclean spirits. He's not afraid to be approached by unclean people. He's not afraid to touch unclean things. Like, this is Jesus. Like, he wins. He beats all of it. It's so good. So, okay. I get nerded out on stuff like that. So
I think that's like a model for us in some way, like, to not be afraid of dealing with the unclean things, or like to not have to follow these kinds of ceremonial clean law things.
Well, what Jesus says to the religious leaders when he's confronted with the hand washing, so Catherine, I see your comment here. As Jews, would Jesus and disciples wash their hands for Sabbath ceremony? Yes, probably. We just don't have any record of them doing this in the New Testament, was the point that I was making. But for us as followers of Jesus, like, the Spirit of Christ, the Holy Spirit, is in us. And so we can walk with confidence, knowing that that we are secure in Christ's saving work more than in any other thing. So should we follow all of these purity codes? We don't have to. Should we carry the principles of public health with us, just as a way of trying to be good citizens? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea to like say, like, if you touch somebody who's on their period, that doesn't mean that you have to go outside of the camp for a day. Like, that's not what, like, the principle for us today. But if you are ill and you don't want other people to get sick, don't go where people are. Like, isolate yourself. Let your body process the illness and get back into good health and be restored. But we don't have to do we don't have to go get a bird and dip it in water and blood of another bird and, like, take it outside to not like Snoqualmie Falls far enough away from a town to say, "Be free, bird, take my impurity." Like we don't have to do that. But yeah. So did that answer your question? Like it's a yes and. Like we don't have to worry about it, but we should practice good practice. So
Yeah.
okay.
Can I ask you a question? Because I know what Jewish law, they believe in the first 5 books of the Bible, right? That's
Mhm.
considered the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
So how long did they actually go by these rules, and did they ever not do them anymore? I mean, do they still do them now? I don't think so, right?
The answer to that is depends. So the Jewish people still hold to the what we call the Old Testament. They call the Tanakh, which is the law, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets, or the writings, the prophets. No, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. So the wisdom literature, so Psalms, Proverbs, all that. That's wisdom literature. The prophets are from Samuel through like the historical books are considered part of the prophets because of Samuel. Anyway, so those 3 major divisions of the Old Testament. We have a range of people who in the Jewish community who are keeping kosher laws and keeping laws like these, and those who are not. There are no, to my knowledge, there are no Jewish communities who are offering like the full sacrificial system because there is no temple.
Right.
And so the sacrifices have to be done in the temple, but like Passover is still a thing. And so while it is not like a sacrifice, they are still eating lamb and doing the elements of the Passover. But they don't do like the Day of Atonement with the Holy of Holies and all that stuff because there's no temple. So that is one of the hopes that the Jewish people have, is that someday the temple will be restored and they will be able to worship Yahweh in the temple. Whether or not that's going to happen, I don't know. There's all kinds of end times theories around how this all works out. What we do know in the New Testament for Christians is we believe there's a new heavens and a new earth, and that is when we know there will be that God will dwell among us. But even then, we're not making sacrifices because God is with us and there's no more sin. So that's beyond the scope of your question, I realize, but yeah. So some people are keeping kosher laws, some people are keeping purity laws like this, and some are not.
So then when they talk about kosher, the kosher law, that's what this is.
Well, kosher laws generally are talking about food.
Oh, okay.
And
Certain
so
type.
like certified kosher, yeah. So if you go to the grocery store and you see that like circle with a K in it on an item, that's telling you that this food is certified kosher. And so a observant Jew could consume that food. But that is for food that is in the grocery store. Whatever you're doing in your house, if you're observing kosher, you have to follow a lot of household rules. And so, yeah. Chrissy, you have family members who are Jewish,
Yeah.
and I don't know if they are observant for kosher or not.
They're what they consider themselves high holiday Jews. So they observe Passover and they do fasting on Rosh Hashanah for a day. I did work with, when I was in LA, I worked with an Orthodox Jewish man, and he had to buy a house that was within walking distance of his temple, because he could not drive after sunset on Friday night until sunset on Saturday. And so, and he keeps kosher. There were certain restaurants in LA that were certified kosher that he could go to for business meetings. So his wife always kept her hair covered. He didn't wear a wedding ring, and he always had his yarmulke. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it was pretty intense. But yeah, they're among the Jewish communities that I interacted with down there. There was Orthodox, there was observant, and then there was like my family who is Jewish or my husband's family who's Jewish by ethnicity, and they just keep the kosher or the Passover and the Rosh Hashanah, kind of like the Christians that show up at the Easter and Christmas Eve services. So
yeah. So there's just, thank you, Christy. That helps to see like the wide range of observance. So, and as a non-Jewish person, like I can't speak too much into the actual experience. So I'm glad that you were able to speak a little bit into it, because you are experiencing this more than I am. So
yeah.
Cool. Awesome. All right, y'all. Well, let's call it here, and we will come back next week and we'll talk about the Day of Atonement. And I'm excited. We're gonna get into the holiest day of the year. So it'll be fun. So y'all have a great week. I'll see some of you on Sunday, and some of you I'll see around. So God bless everyone.
I'll see you at men's group
All right.
Saturday morning.
Yes, sir. Yep.
All right.
All right. Bye.
Bye now.
Guys, good night.
Good night.